My name is Matt Hofmann. I'm the Master Distiller and one of the co-founders of Westland Distillery. We make single malt whiskey here in Seattle. Master Distiller is a funny thing because I very rarely distill these days. I do a lot of spreadsheets, send a lot of emails, but I also get to talk to people about kind of the exciting things that we do here. One of the interesting things, again, we're kind of talking about dinner last night, we all got together. One of the things that kind of echoes both the talk that we just saw and then the things we're talking about at dinner is the idea of mastering something, I think, is false. It is something we can constantly strive towards. We're trying to always get to perfection. And we were talking about the excellence thing, but we'll never get there. And to think that you will get there, to think that you will ever be the master of something is arrogant, in my opinion. So when we say master distiller, functionally what that means is kind of in charge of the process start to finish. It does not mean that I've mastered distilling in any way. I don't believe that that is possible. So single malt whiskey is the original style of whiskey that has been produced, at least as far as recorded history goes, for about 600 years. The origin of it is probably Ireland, unless you're asking the Scottish people, in which case it's Scotland. But it's the origin of all other styles of whiskey. So basically, Scottish, Irish immigrants move to other parts of the world, especially the U.S., find that barley doesn't grow very well in the eastern U.S., they plant rye instead, or take the rye that the German immigrants have. They use that to make their whiskey. Then they all get kicked out of there in something called the Whiskey Rebellion, which is a very fantastic story we don't have time for today. And they have to move down to Kentucky where they find corn is a lot better, and that's where bourbon comes from. Single malt whiskey is 100% malted barley. What malted barley is basically sprouted barley. So barley grows, has been growing for thousands of years, and it's really kind of reached its pinnacle expression in these kind of cooler climates where you have a cooler spring, kind of like the UK and also like the Pacific Northwest, as it turns out. So 100% malted barley. So what they're going to do is they're going to take that raw barley, they're going to soak it in water for a few days. Then the barley grain goes, hey, it just rained, so I'll take this water in and it'll begin to sprout. So it goes along and it develops a rootlet and some shoots. And then there's all sorts of things happening inside of the grain, basically developing enzymes in the grain that help convert starch into sugar. All of this is very important when it comes to processing the whiskey, but we need to stop it so it doesn't grow into a full barley plant, because that would be disastrous. So they stop it by drying it out, and that is what we call malted barley. So that's used in beer as well as single malt whiskey. So the single part means produced at one distillery, and this, again, most of the time you're seeing this come out of Scotland. So that's kind of, that's what we do here. The Pacific Northwest is the best barley growing climate in the United States. It is one of the best barley growing climates in the world. Outside of the UK, Pacific Northwest are the two best ones in the Northern Hemisphere. So a lot of people say, oh, you guys are Americans, why aren't you making bourbon? Well, actually, it's more authentic for us to be making single malt whiskey here because barley is what grows here and not corn. Corn is used for bourbon. So this is barley. Everybody say hello, barley. Everything that's used in the world of single malt whiskey is commodity barley. It doesn't actually matter, and this is true not just for whiskey, but it's also true for beer and any kind of baking products that use barley. It's all commodity barley. So what does that mean? So commodity barley, or any commodity grain, is bred for high yield in the field, high yield in the plant, in our case, in the distillery. It's bred for disease resistance, and it's also bred for, what's my last thing there? It's bred to be dependable. It's bred that you can count on it every time when you go to make whiskey, like when we do, but also the farmers know what they're going to get. Then you get these varieties certified by various organizations. In the US, it's called the AMBALIS, American Malted Barley Association. All of these things are admirable. The ability to do high yields and disease resistance makes things grow, and you know what you're going to get. But there are also some downsides to that, and those aren't commonly talked about. This barley varietal that you see here, this is called Full Pint. This is a new barley varietal bred by Oregon State University. Keep this in mind as we look through the rest of these slides here. This is what, if you ask a Scottish person what barley looks like, they're going to say it looks exactly like this. And barley has only ever looked exactly like this. So here's the thing about commodities. If you're running commodities, you're probably doing monoculture. So that means you're planting the same crop year after year after year after year. The US has mastered this in a really, really depressing way. I mean, the middle of the country is corn, 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 corn. Each year, that corn is depleting the soil. It is taking things out of the soil. They can dump things back in. Before they learned how to dump things back in, they simply moved away. This is the origin of the Dust Bowl. This is people moved out kind of into the plain states, planted a bunch of stuff, then kind of forgot to take care of it all, and then destroyed it, and then they kept moving. But now, these days, people are able to dump synthetic stuff back into the soil over and over and over again. It's not good for the soil, though. It's not good for the environment. You talk about all this extra stuff that you have to put into the system. This also includes diseases. If you break up the crops, if you plant this and then do a different crop, different crop, different crop, then the disease has time to go away. Otherwise, it just builds and builds and builds and builds year after year. The other big thing is that commodity grains are price fixed. It's a race to the bottom. I just finished reading a great book. I'd highly recommend it. It's called Gaining Ground. It's about a farmer out in Virginia, I believe, and he inherited. He was probably my age. He's in his 20s, and he inherited. So I am in my 20s. That's true, actually. So, anyways, he inherited a farm from his grandparents, and he got really, really into the idea of planting grains, and so he planted corn and soy, and he made it through the first season, the first harvest, and he got all the way to the end. There was a little bit of drought and some things that were going on there, and he sold all of it. He had 300 acres of this stuff and sold all of it, tallied everything up at the end of the year, and he realized he made exactly $18. And that's because the price is fixed. It's a race to the bottom no matter what. You can't add value to a commodity crop because that's against the definition. And the other big thing is it's always bred for yield. The idea of flavor does not come into consideration ever, which is really, really remarkable, actually. So again, there's some admirable things about commodities, but there's a lot of negatives. So what do we do to try to fix this? This is the resurgence that we're talking about here, a return to original styles of farming, to rotation crops. So you're going to get things that are going to help the soil, going to help each other out. There's a lot of examples of this throughout the world. The rest of the world knows this. A lot of cuisines are based on this idea of rotation crops. But in America, we sadly have no real concept of it because we've always kind of been able to either take more land or develop chemicals to get around it. Getting value out of these products, not just breeding them for a commodity system where you put it into a giant truck that goes to a giant train car and it goes to a giant commodity market and you're done with it. Let's add value to these products. You can do that if you take control. But then also flavor. And this is a big thing. I'm going to kind of get into this in a little bit, but let's actually think about flavor as we develop new grains. So this is the Skagit Valley. You can see that there. In Washington State, the barley regions are kind of split into two places. You've got Eastern Washington, which is big. That's big ag country. We get a lot of barley from Eastern Washington, but the system there is very much commodity system. There's 2 varietals of barley that are grown out there amongst the thousands that exist, and they grow effectively. But that will come in, and the farmers, you never meet them. But Western Washington is a little bit different. They've rejected the commodity system for a lot of very simple reasons. So the Skagit Valley there, those are tulips. A lot of people here will know that the Skagit Valley is famous for its tulip festival. What they probably don't know is that those tulips basically just destroy the soil. Not totally, but they can't do the tulips in the same place, generally speaking, year after year, because it takes so much material to make those tulips work. So what these farmers have been doing for 100 years is they've been planting barley after the tulips to help put carbon back into the soil. Barley is actually a carbon fixing. It sucks carbon out of the atmosphere, puts it back into the soil, breaks disease cycles. Then they'll plant something like beans, which put nitrogen back into the soil, and away they go. Then they can plant tulips again. They don't have to dump a bunch of extra stuff in there. And that's a natural crop rotation cycle. This is how a lot of agricultural communities have existed for a long time. The problem is that they had nobody to sell that grain to. They were outside of the commodity system. Even if you were, farming in Western Washington is a lot more expensive than it is in Eastern Washington. If you manage to get perfect grain out of this barley, you might break even if it made what's called malting grade, so it'd be high-grade barley, but on the commodity system. If not, you would get feed-grade barley, which goes to cattle, and that you lose money planting that. But they have to do it because it's good for their soil. This barley here, so you remember the barley I was just showing you a little bit ago. This barley is called purple obsidian. I'm going to come up with, there's a lot of names here that you're going to see. We're not involved with marijuana at all. Purple obsidian, Tibetan purple, there's all sorts of, no. So anyways, this is a varietal of barley that comes from Egypt. It's 2,000 years old. There's an almost unbelievable backstory involving some camel trading routes in eastern Washington. It's very bizarre. But this is not an approved varietal for planting for malting barley in Washington state. Why not? Well, there's all sorts of reasons, but one of them is it malts in 4 days instead of 7. So actually, if you're thinking about this, it malts faster than what the standard is. But just because it moves away from what the standard is, it makes it totally rejectable. So one of the things that we move to do, and we have to work with other companies to do this. We're working with a company called Skagit Valley Malting to accomplish this, is basically changing the system to suit the grain, to suit the agriculture, and not changing your agriculture to suit your system. This is only really possible now with technology. So you can change each different batch. You have to be more patient. It costs more money, yes, but the flavor that you get from something like this is unbelievable. People have never tasted it. How many of you have tasted just an unbelievable piece of whole wheat bread that totally changed your mind? There's not enough of you. This is the problem, but but that's out there when you taste it, and it totally just, you have no concept of this if you're just raised on Wonder Bread and all this other stuff that we are as Americans. And so this is a very, very important thing. You can take the varietals that are not just for malting, but a feed varietal. That full pint back there, 2 slides ago, that was a feed varietal. That's also not approved for malting under the approved list. And yet, you can malt it and you get incredible flavor out of it. So that's a really, really important thing to think about when you think about flavor first. Just try to get the thing that tastes best and then work backwards from there to make it work. In order for this to work, you need grain breeders who are going to help you develop new varietals of barley. And I don't mean GMO, I mean kind of the old-fashioned way of breeding grain, which is you take 2 grains and you kind of rub them together like this, and I wouldn't be good at this. I'm not a teacher. But it's developing grains the old-fashioned way. Start to finish, that process usually takes 10 years from the time you make the first cross to the time that it could be approved. If you start with 1,000 varietals, you might be lucky if you get one that works. So there's a guy named Dr. Steve Jones. He was out breeding wheat and barley at Washington State University Pullman. Monsanto approached him and said, "Will you develop a varietal of wheat for us that we can patent?" He said no. That may sound obvious. He said, "I'm a land-grant university professor. You're not supposed to breed for companies, supposed to breed for the public good." He's the only one in the US that said no. He was banished from this university, from Washington State University Pullman. And before you think this is a political thing, Big Ag reaches across both sides of the aisle when this happened. So he was kicked up to Mount Vernon, an hour to the north of us, basically allowed to do whatever he wanted. They stripped him of all of his funding, save his salary and his assistant salary, which continues to this day, by the way. Everything that he's done up to this point, he's only done with 2 people's salaries and no other funding of any sort. And basically said, all right, go nuts up there. And so up there, the farmers initially, and then other companies, Westland helps fund this as well, but also companies like Cliff Bar, Whole Foods, Patagonia, Chipotle, have to fund his work in developing varietals of grain for flavor instead of just for yield. That's 15,000 varietals of barley that he's got in there. In Scotland, they only use 1 varietal of barley. So if you can imagine, if you know like the world of wine, Merlot, what if all wine was Merlot? Who's seen the movie Sideways? Okay, so whatever you think about Merlot, even if it's an amazing Merlot, if every wine was Merlot, how boring would that be? Now, I'll caveat this by saying the world of Scottish whiskey has produced a lot of great stuff, and that's even increasing these days. There's a ton of great stuff out there, and I have a lot of respect for what goes on in the Scottish whiskey industry for the most part. But there are so many new possibilities of getting beyond this high-yielding type of barley varietal if you start thinking about flavor. Who cares if it yields 10% less? Charge 20% more for it because people go nuts over it. People love things that taste good. It's really not actually that complicated. So the Bread Lab up there is doing amazing things. You'll find them in documentaries. Again, all of their funding is coming from donations, mostly from kind of progressive companies and from individuals. Big Ag has removed everything else from them. So this is a big deal. The end result from all of this, what they're trying to do is make sure that these varietals, they're breeding these varietals to grow well in the Washington state climate, in the Pacific Northwest climate. So you don't have to dump things back into the system, back into the agricultural system that don't belong there. The farmers now will take these varietals and make a living off of them. Before, they would just feed it to cows because they couldn't bother to sell it on the commodity market. Now we can go in and say, hey, we will pay you not just above commodity market value, we'll pay you good money for this grain that you're breeding here, even though it's yielding maybe, 50% less per acre even, we'll pay you the difference and then some to make sure that you get paid a living wage. And ultimately, really the important thing that comes out of it is you make better product. And what's exciting about this is applicable beyond whiskey. This is applicable to a lot of things. There's a huge movement going on right now in this country, and it's just getting started for this style of thinking. We talk about things like triple bottom line, where everybody wins. People get paid more money, the environment ends up better, and ultimately you develop better, more compelling products with better flavor. And this is something we should always be striving for. It's something we're pushing very hard on, and something we want the whole world to see. So that's what we got. Thank you very much.